some new faces today. And I asked one person, but it's small companies, you know, why are you here? But Hugh is one of our absolute best and tireless researchers. And so it's always a pleasure to have him. But before he gets a chance to say anything, I have to do my plug. We've got some great 250th programs lined up, and next week, the 26th, I'm sorry, is recognizing the enslaved in Westerly, and that will be Hugh, who has done an excellent job.
A little louder.
I will speak a little louder. Thank you, Meg. I said at the last program, I've got new hearing aids, and so I think I'm doing my teacher voice, and obviously I'm not, and I appreciate being told. Believe me, because everything I say is so important. May 2nd, put that on your calendars. That is our open house, and we have been working away for a long time on an exhibit in the house. Every room has an interesting question in it. Sometimes there are no answers, but they're designed to make you think. And in the Isaac Smith room, we will have the letters that Benjamin Franklin and Joshua exchanged, and Hugh did our research on that. And I want to tell him something exciting that I discovered from that. Now we have to have the program. Joshua's will, the inventory that was done, and most importantly, his role in the Act of Renunciation, because Rhode Island was, of course, the first colony to declare independence 2 months before the rest of the colonies caught up. So do come, there'll be something for everyone, original recipes from the Revolutionary War time. We discovered those in the cellar, the food that is. And then on May 3rd, the day after that, the conspiracy to destroy the British revenue schooner Gaspee in 1772, and the speaker is the person who's in charge of that whole Gaspee operation. So that will be good as well. But our guest today, our speaker today is Hugh, and I think he's covered the big, the medium companies, and now he's gotten down to the companies that sometimes were quite ephemeral, here today and gone tomorrow.
Thanks, Ellen, and glad to see so many people here. So I started learning about Westerly Granite when Ellen told me that my great-grandfather's company, Lazary and Barton, had a quarry in Westerly, which I knew nothing about, and my father, who was alive at that time, and my aunt and my uncle, none of them knew anything about it. So anyway, I've been researching companies ever since, and so this is a whole bunch of advertisements, or here we have the couple pages from the directory, Sullivan Granite, Ferquellian Versa, Columbia Granite. Over on the far right is, if you heard my talk on Westerly Red and Pink Granite, that's the advertisement for the auction sale for the Lanphier quarry up sort of in the north part of town. And I put it on this slide intentionally because I've handed out something which I'll explain to you all in a bit, but that isn't actually in the list of companies and all the stuff that I'm going forward. So not every company have I collected information about. If you go to the museum website, there are exhibits. There's a Granite exhibit. This is the Granite exhibit, and then there's essentially a colonial exhibit about the Babcock house. And you see, you can learn information about the types of granite and the types of monuments and the companies. And if you click on Read More, you'll go to the companies page where there are 10 companies listed. And why are they there? Well, because some of them are the biggest companies like Sullivan. Some of them are just sort of random because I happen to be related to Lazary and Barton, so Lazary and Barton is there. And, then they asked me to research Columbia and for quality and Brusa. So anyway, it's a bit of a hodgepodge of what's there in those 10 companies, but I think you'll find lots of interesting information. At the very top, you'll find the link, that red box, that says it will go to the company's list. And it will go to not this list, but the list that's derived from this. This is the list as it was published in Built from Stone, the volume that Alan and helped write. And so there's 105 companies here. And some of them you probably recognize. Buzzy Memorials and Camoli Grant are two companies that are still in operation now. Smith Granite Company, obviously this is the Babcock-Smith house. Joseph Kaduri and Marzoli. E.C. King, he was a sculptor as opposed to quarrying. Murray and Bird, honestly I knew nothing about Murray and Bird, but there was a recent inquiry from somebody about Rowan Veal. I knew nothing about Rowan Veal, but again, they recently came up. So, I was wondering if I could get a better picture of the changes in the granite industry over, now it's a century and 3/4, from essentially about 1850 to 2025. And that's what I'm going to try and convey you. At the end, I'm going to get to a little talk about sort of 4 specific companies, but mostly I'm going to try and characterize the industry overall. When were the companies formed, or at least when were they listed in things like the New England Business Directory, which are digitized and available online from 1856 to 1922. They continue, but for copyright reasons, they're not accessible online. You have to go to the library, and I haven't made it to the library lately to do that. I'm showing you on the right the 1860 page from the directory for Rhode Island, and this is G's. Notice we have gold refiners, grain dealers, grindstones, grist mills. What's missing? Granite anything. The only thing in the 1860 directory, the New England Business Directory, is under quarriers, and it's Smith Granite A. Burdick as the person. So then, how long did companies last? How many workers did they have? The worker information comes from the Rhode Island Factory Inspection Reports. Those reports actually start earlier than 1905, but it's only in 1905 when they start reporting on the granite industry. Through 1937 with some graphs, and I'll show you more about that later. If you go to the local history page at the Westerly Library, you can look at the Westerly city directories and the tax books, and there's a lot more mining that could be done there. And then other sources of other histories and books, including Built from Stone. So, graph. The x-axis goes from 1840 to 2000. I flipped it off. Each bar is a company. Now, there are more or less 81 companies of the over 110 on this graph. And in a few cases, as you'll see if you look, I combined a few companies, and you can argue about whether I should have or shouldn't have, and I probably would do it differently now than I did a while back when I put this together. But personally, I love this graph. You can see there's really long bars, there's really short bars. Some companies didn't last very long. So let's try and learn more about, these companies. And I'm a scientist, so I'm sorry, this whole talk almost is graphs. I hope to convince you that there are good stories in graphs. So, of course, at the bottom here we have Smith Granite Company. They often said they were founded in 1846 in their various promotional literature. They, certainly Smith was in the granite and stone business at that point, but in 1847, we have in the safe deposit box the purchase and sale for this property, the Babcock farm of about 200 acres, and in 1848 it was closed on. And it goes to the 1950s. We have New England granite and Rhode Island granite, and if you were here a few programs back, Ashley Hansen gave us a wonderful talk about James Barrison, and these were both his companies. And whether they should really be considered two separate companies or one company, I don't know. In the business directories, they're listed separately. We have Ellen Madison's how many greats do we need? Richard Dopey, the little blue bar there. We have Lazary and Barton. And notice how long that bar is. It goes from about 1890 to the 1950s. So this is an example of how this graph is wonderful but also misleading. They did buy a quarry in Westerly. We do know that they were going to erect a huge derrick in, I've forgotten the date of that newspaper article. But my suspicion is that they really, if they only used it probably no later than the early 1900s. Lazary and Barton both died 1912, 1915, and I don't think they were using it after that. They were largely a memorials business in the Bronx, opposite Woodlawn Cemetery. They were hugely successful. They continued operating into the 1950s, and they paid their taxes. That bar is as long as it is because I went through every textbook in the Westerly Library and checked. And they paid their taxes until they closed down and the property was transferred to individual officers who then stopped paying taxes, and the town, auctioned it off for non-payment of taxes. But, so that bar indicates how long Lazary and Barton existed. With the Westerly connection, they actually existed a little earlier. But it doesn't tell you anything about the activity level. Dixon granite, this little green bar. I love Dixon because, again, when I did the red and pink talk, Dixon had a nice rectangular property lines. And you can see those property lines today, and so they help you anchor all the other properties, Calder and Kearney and Smith North Quarry, etc. E.C. King and Sons, I highlight again just because they're so different. They're a sculptor. Columbia granite, Sullivan granite, Kaduri granite. And here I actually combined Kaduri and Marzoli and Joseph Kaduri Company into one bar, which arguably they should be two bars. Ferquelli and Brusa in purple, Buzzy Memorials in green, founded in the early 1930s, so in a few more years, they'll be 100 years old. Bonner Monument and Camoli Grant. And again, I clipped this at 2000, so those two, Buzzy and Camoli, would go on to today. So if we look here in 1940, you see that there are only 7 bars that cross that blue box for 1940, and one of them is Lazary and Barton, which really wasn't doing anything except paying their taxes. But you see, a lot of the sort of the bigger, what we think of today as the bigger companies, Ferquelli, Brusa, Kaduri, Sullivan, Columbia, Smith. This purple box is 1904 to 1916. You see how many bars there are that go through that time period. And we'll come back to this time period and you'll see why. So those are all the companies that are on here. They're not all the companies. In a few cases I combined several companies. Companies were more fluid. I partner with somebody this year and I partner with somebody else next year, should I have those as two separate companies, or are they one company that I'm partnering with two different people? So anyway, okay, so here's the question of when were they formed, or maybe better stated, listed, because they had to get into the business directory. So one thing is, people may have had operations around town in their backyards. They were very skilled at something and they did work, and they wouldn't make it into the business directory. So I don't have them listed as a company. So if we start before 1880, there are 10 red bars at the bottom here. And there should really be at least one more. That would be the Lanphier Quarry, which later went on to become Calder and Kearney, but it was never listed in the business directory for whatever reason. Now, I did add a little information because the business directories start after Smith Granite was formed. Or they, as I say, 1860 is the first year Smith Granite is listed. Okay, then for the decade 1880 1889 in green we have 16 companies. And then the next decade in blue we have 16 companies. Sorry to anybody who's blue-green colorblind and can't tell the difference. In purple, 1900 to 1909, we have 24 companies formed. Oh, I wanted to say, if you look at the 1890 here, you notice there's a whole bunch of really short-lived little companies. I don't know what was going on. Anyway, 1909, there's 24 companies. 1910 to 1919, 7, and then after that, 8 companies formed, 2 of which are still operating. So, how long did the companies exist? And again, if you researched any of these companies individually, you might find different dates than I have pulled together from the business directories, the factory inspection reports, and so forth. So we have only one company of more than 100 years, and that's Smith Granite. They'll be joined shortly by Buzzy Memorials. And then we have 7 companies that are in the 50 to 99 years, Sullivan, Columbia, Kaduri, where I've combined Kaduri and Marzoli and Joseph Kaduri Company, Bonner Monuments. If we go to the other extreme, less than a decade, 1 to 9 years, is 38 companies. So about half of the companies existed for less than 10 years. Now, I don't think this is particularly surprising, right? This is sort of the churn of, smaller and larger businesses that goes on. But this gives us sort of an indication of what it was for the companies that we can identify as Westerly Granite companies. This graph is now different. I'm listing the number of companies that were listed in operation for that year. And so, again, we go from 1840, but now up to 2025 over there, all the way up to 2040 on the Excel graph. And there were up to 30 companies operating. That highest point is 30 companies. So we have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30 companies. And so, again, out of the 81 that I'm talking about, there were never more than 30 operating at one time. And built from some, in the table of contents, if you read the book, they divided the granite industry up into periods. And of course, that was based on a lot more than just how many companies there were. But it's kind of interesting to think about. So 1846 to 1880, the beginning. So that red bar is 1880, and out of the 10 companies that I have before 1880, you see that as many as 8 were operating at one time. We didn't have so much turnover in the very early period of the companies that we know about as companies. From 1880 to 1900, they called it the heyday. And notice you get this large increase from 8 companies up to 30 companies in that time period, operating listed as operating simultaneously. From 1900 to 1930, they called it a time of change, and they're talking about all sorts of things, the kind of products that were being made, the machinery that was being used in the quarry, the judgments that they made, doing these separations were not just on the number of companies. So that last red bar is 1900, and notice we have this period when we have a bunch of companies, and then we have a big drop off down to about 8 again, and then we have the mid-20th century, and we know there's relatively few companies operating up to today. If we look at this period again, from 1904 to 1916, it's kind of interesting because the number of companies is really pretty stable, 26 to 29 companies in that purple box. You see, it's just sort of bouncing around a little bit, but it's pretty stable for 12, 13 years. But interestingly, employment during this time drops from 1,200 people reported to 400 people reported in the Rhode Island factory inspection reports. And so that's this graph. So again, 1900 to 1940, now it's the number of workers on the y-axis. And so if we again look at this period, 1904 to 1916, you see the first couple of years, 1905 and 6, we have close to 1,200 workers, and then it sort of steadily declines down to about 400 workers. Now again, how the Rhode Island factory inspection reports determine which companies they inspected, I'm not entirely clear on, but I'll show you a bit more about those reports in a minute. But they're very interesting, and they're very useful for giving us a perspective on the number of workers. And you see then a fairly steady employment around 400 with a big drop off. I guess that's probably the Depression, 1928 or so, and then dropping down to about 200 out to 1937 when those reports stopped reporting numbers of workers at individual companies. So what are these? Well, I'm showing you here pictures. These are in the Rhode Island State Archives in Providence. This is the 12th annual report of factory inspection, Rhode Island 1905. So they started in the 1890s. And the law originally was focused on protecting children and women in the workplace. And so they didn't report on male workers for the first several years. It's not until this 12th report, maybe the 11th, I can't remember that one before, that they start reporting on male workers. So, mostly before that it was women and children working like in textile industry, or not, Granite wasn't where they were working. So on the far right, you see they report, the different counties and each town. So down at the bottom we have Washington County, and at the very bottom we have Westerly, and they report the men, the women, and the children 16 and under working in the inspected industry. Sorry, this shows adults and children, and then the total. Then you continue on, and they show for each town, so here is Westerly, the establishments that they inspected. Bannon's drugstore had 5 men and 1 woman, so it's men, women, boys under 16, girls under 16. You see down here, Calder and Kearney, Granite Quarry, Caddo Granite Company. And they report the number of workers. Calder and Kearney 12, Caddo had 30. Columbia Granite, and then it goes on. And when there are separate regions, so over on the subsequent page, you see Niantic down there at the bottom. Father Hill and up top there, White Rock. And so what I did was to collect all this information just on the Granite companies, to create the graphs, help create the graphs I'm showing you. Now, in 1932, the format changes somewhat from 32 to 37. They're no longer printed, they're typed, as you see here. Again, we have the list of all the counties and all the towns and the numbers of workers. And so I'm showing you on the right example of a typed out page. And we'll notice here, for example, for quality versa, carvers and sculptors, 10. And here they inspected in April and they inspected in October. And so for these years, I just averaged the values for the spring and the fall inspections when I did the graphs that I've been showing you of the number of workers. So here's some more graphs. Sorry, I love graphs. On the left, we have the inspected facilities in Westerly. Now, the blue line is the line I've shown you. This is the number of workers on the y-axis. This is 1,000, so here's our 1,200 workers, and then it drops off. And the orange line is the total number of workers in the Westerly inspected facilities. So what you see is that there's a large increase from around, 1,500, 2,000 up to 3,000 workers in Westerly in facilities that were inspected. And so what that means is you have a combination of that there was growth in other industries than granite and a decrease in granite. And you see that dramatically when you plot on the right the number of the workers as a percent of the inspected workforce. So in those first several years, 60 to 70% of the workers who were inspected were in the granite industry. So that's 1905 to 1909. And then it really drops off down to 1915. You see that big decline, which is a combination of that there was a big growth in other industries that were inspected, as well as a sort of slow decline in
Well, there was a war there too.
yeah, 1917, but the decrease is before the war. This is 1909, and this is 1915. So that's, before we formally enter World War II in 1917. I mean, sure, the war's starting to impact things, but this decline, now again, a big part of that is the increase here in other kinds of industries in Westerly, because you'll notice that things are, they're going down here, but they're not going down all that dramatic.
You just briefly, would that be textiles, or what would be contributing to that increase in other industries?
Honestly, that's a great question, and I probably should have looked. I didn't. You have to look through, all the individual companies. As I recall, they never do breakouts by sort of kinds of businesses. They just either tell you the total for the town, or the state, or the county, or they tell you the individual company numbers. So you would have to go through and see who that was. But clearly there was.
We did have a lot of textiles.
Oh yeah, but the question is that growth due to textiles, or is the growth due to something else? I don't honestly know that.
Well, you had cotton over in Pawcatuck too, really growing at that time.
Who?
Cotton, printing presses in Pawcatuck.
Yeah, but Pawcatuck's not in Rhode Island, so it was not part of the
But
factory
Pawcatuck had a
inspection.
Westerly, Rhode Island address until the 50s.
Okay, so we can double check,
Yes.
but I don't believe that there are Pawcatuck businesses
Yeah.
in the Rhode Island factory.
No, but it might have
inspection.
accounted for the loss of workers in Westerly.
Yeah,
I was just curious if some of the businesses would have like merged together.
sure, I mean, companies merge and, you know.
Oh, okay, cause I was just
Come
wondering.
and
if-
go. I mean, again, what's in the Rhode Island factory inspection reports are they went to some company, they give the name of the company, they give the number of workers broken down by male, female, and children, males and females under 16.
I know you didn't look at the other industries, but offhand, do you know where the hotels were inspected as a business?
So,
And it's okay if you say you don't know, because that's okay, but I'm thinking that that was the heyday of the big hotels in Watch Hill.
Right.
so here's, you know, this is 1932, and we have coal, meats, drugs, novelty curtains, restaurants, monuments, plumbers, grocers, groceries, carvers and sculptors, groceries, garage, bank. So they inspected all kinds of things, and again, I honestly didn't study it enough to understand what their criteria were for who they inspected versus who they didn't inspect. Yes.
With the granite, like how are the reserves, like was like that type of thing kind of overdeveloped, like in the granite menu? How do I
So-
articulate it, like?
Yes, I mean, you're getting at, you know, certainly the ease of quarrying granite became more difficult over the history of the industry. And that certainly impacted the industry, so, you know, as it moved to, for example, larger companies that, like Sullivan, that implemented, you know, specific quarrying techniques that allowed them to access granite that otherwise wouldn't have been accessible. So, you know, as I say, like, you know, there are many factors that come into play. I mean, you know, a big factor is the switch to using steel for buildings, right? So you don't build all granite buildings.
Also the types of granite.
The types of granite, I mean, there are all kinds of factors. So this is just giving us a snapshot of some specific things, the number of companies, how long they lasted, the numbers of workers involved. You know, part of why there might be fewer workers is they were using more machinery, and you didn't have all these lines of guys pounding to split the stone the same way as you had early on. I mean, there are a whole range of factors that impact.
Also, as Weekapaug and Watch Hill developed, since the granite industry was heavily immigrants, I bet that a lot of that immigration probably went to landscaping and domestic servants and stuff down in Watch Hill and Weekapaug during that time period you're talking about.
Okay, so now we'll continue with the information in the Rhode Island factory inspection reports, but sort of focus in less on the overall industry and a little bit on, you know, individual companies. And we'll start with some of the large companies. So this is what's reported for Smith Granite Company, and you see from 1905 to 1937 that they oscillate around, but they tend to have around, over a little bit over 100 workers. They go way up. I think that might be when they acquired Barrison's New England or Rhode Island Granite, Okay, now here we have New England Granite in orange. So notice they start out in 1905 with 300 workers, where Smith has 110 or so. But then they come down pretty quickly, and then they disappear there in 1924, I think it is, and that's then when they got acquired by Smith. If we add in some other companies, in purple we have Joseph Newell. They started out again around, a little less than 150 workers. 1905 to 1910, they've been dropped down to, less than 100 by 1915-50. Gourlay Granite Works. In black, we have Sullivan Granite, so they were a much later company. So they start being reported in 1921, I think that is, and they go up, 100, 150 workers, and then again in the 1930s, the Depression and sort of the early pre-World War II period, dropping back down. Interestingly, for a couple of companies, New England Granite, they report the quarry and the shed separately. And so the orange line at the top is simply the sum of those two. The colors aren't showing up much different. The bottom line is the quarry, and the middle line is the sheds. This is supposed to be a darker red. They had 100 people in the quarry to start with and 200 in the sheds. And then the sheds drop, but also the quarry drops off. Whoops. Okay. This is the Newell Company. Again, they report the quarry and the shed. And in this case, the quarry and the sheds are more similar, around 70, 80 workers. And that just puts them all in one graph. If we look at the Kaduri companies, here in blue we have Kaduri and Marzoli, a sort of medium-sized operation, 9 to 18 or so people being reported. And then once he forms the Joseph Kaduri Company, becomes much bigger, so 40 to 60 people generally across this time period. And then we're going to end with oak and spruce. Oak and spruce being an intersection in Westerly of oak and spruce streets. And we'll see in a minute why I chose to do this. But we have data on 4 companies. So in blue, we have Columbia Granite, and they exist from 1904 to 1958. So they have data for the entire period of the Rhode Island Factory Inspection Reports from 1905 to 1937. And you see that they range from, 6 to 18 people over that time period. They had a fire in 1922, which is right here, and there's no obvious impact on that fire on their reported employment. They had purchased the old Hopkinton Road facility several years before that fire and essentially shifted their operation from the Oak and Spruce location out to Old Hopkinton Road. Verquelli and Brusa is in red over on the far right, the left is orange. They existed from 1923 to 52, so we have data from 1923, well actually it looks later, 1927, 28, something like that, to 37, the factory inspection reports. They leased a shed at Oak and Spruce, but in 1936 they had a fire. And actually, when I put together my history of Verquelli and Brusa that's on the website, I missed the fire. It wasn't until I went to see Vio DiPaolo's exhibit at the library that I found out about the fire. And so you're going to hear a whole bunch more about the fire, and you'll see why in a minute. But anyway, it again destroyed their shed in 36, and there's only data for 36 and 37, but there's no obvious change in employment. They're a medium, small company, 10, 11 workers being reported. So this is another kind of data that we have available to us. The Sanborn insurance maps, and these are wonderful. This is the corner of Oak and Spruce Street. So we have Oak Street. I have 4 different maps, 1912, 1921, and 1941. So vertical is Oak, and then to the left you have Spruce Streets. And these are often sort of little inserts, so they've pulled out this region and clipped things off. So we have, oh, sorry, I wanted to say something here before I go on to Oak and Spruce. Oh, that's good, okay. So we also have, in purple, we have Farrell and Sons. Sorry, purple, orange, right here. So they have like, 5 to 8 workers in this period from 1905 to 1918 or so. And then for some reason, there's exactly one data point for William Pellet, this green dot, in 1928 maybe. And why they only got reported 1 year, I don't know.
They may have moved to Providence.
Well, you'll see in a minute that they are on the factory inspection maps. And so yes, they had an operation in Providence, but they had, anyway. So in 1912, up on the top left, we have Columbia Granite clearly labeled on the Sanborn Insurance map. And on the 1921 map, you have Columbia Granite Company, their monumental works. They've added the traveling crane, and you'll notice the little buildings have changed a little bit. Yellow on these maps means it's a wooden building, okay? Because what it was built of mattered. So if it was red, it was brick. It was less likely to burn. I don't remember what the colors were for stone and so forth. Columbia Granite had the fire the next year, 1922. On the 1941 map, you'll notice my blue square there, they're gone. Although we'll come back to that. Okay, up here across Oak Street from Columbia Granite, in 1912 we have A. Farrell and Sons with quite a complex of buildings. At the top we have this sort of bent building, and then so we have 5 buildings there. There's actually a 6th, but it was cut off on this particular year of the map. And you see that 6th building here, but now it's William Pellet, those same buildings. Okay? Stone cutting, storehouse. So this is William Pellet, and here's the 6th building, which is probably really up there too, but they flipped the map at that point. Okay, now we go to 1941. And now it's Fraquelli and Brusa in that same location. Now, notice there are fewer buildings, and the fire at Fraquelli and Brusa was 1936. Those in yellow that are, I'm not showing you. Anyway, these 3 buildings that I drew in are the 3 buildings that have disappeared from the map. So.
And those were part of Crowley?
Sorry?
The 3 that burned were part of
so, yes. This map for 1941 was on one website, and for some reason it was black and white. But remember, these maps are colored, and the color coding matters. So then I found this map in 1941, and I don't know how easily you can see this, but there's Fraquelli and Brusa, and then below them is Butler Brothers Coal Company, and again, in 1936, we have the fire making the front page of the Westerly Sun. Now, if you look carefully here, and it's probably hard to see on this screen, this 1941 map is actually the 1921 map with updating, and they list it that way. And what they've done is to actually mask out the Columbia Granite building there, and notice they didn't mask out the traveling crane back there. And so the three buildings that I showed you that disappeared for Quelly and Brusa, they're masked out on this 1941. In the color version, if you look at it online, you can see that they're masked out.
With that faint outline of them there.
Yes, there's one there.
With that
There's
shed,
another.
the shed still there.
Right, for Quelly and Brusa, that sort of big curved shed is still there. So let's look at this Westerly Sun newspaper article. A blaze which threatened to reach spectacular proportions last night swept through the interior of Quelly and Brusa Granite shed. Caused lots of damage. It's gonna put people out of work, including Fire Chief Columbus Passetti, who is employed there. Now remember, I showed you the factory inspection reports for 36 and 37, and they report about the same number of workers. So apparently they were only out of work for some temporary period of time. The shed is actually owned by Dwight Stillman and leased to Mr. Brusa. Mr. Stillman left yesterday morning for Florida. Now, he had actually, I believe, owned the shed all those earlier times too, that, you know, he had rented it previously to Farrell and then to Pellet and now to Quelly and Brusa. Chief Passetti conducted an inspection of the premises this morning. The exact origin of the blaze is unknown, but he stated that it was probably caused by a spark from a railroad locomotive which lodged in the west corner of the roof. The building is located in the center of a closely congested area. To the west is Westerly Lumber Company. To the east, another granite shed, the Butler Brothers Company in Cadurian Granite. And interestingly, it says the fire was discovered at 9 o'clock by Americus Monte, who was opposite the building on Spruce Street, which I find kind of curious because Columbia Grant's building was gone, so I'm not exactly sure where Americus Monte was that day, but he was there and reported the fire. So it's really unclear to me which buildings burned, because the description sounds as if it would have been this building, the building right next to the railroad tracks. And yet it's the building that's still on the updated 1941 version of the 1921 map. And those three buildings that I showed you are gone. So I don't know. Okay, so let's see. The fire also spread to the office of the company and destroyed drawings, blueprints, and records valued at several $1,000s. So, you know, for both Columbia Granite and for Quelly and Brusa, the fires wiped out a huge amount of the records. So, you know, we're extremely fortunate to have the Smith Grand Order books here, the New England Grand Order books, a number of other records from companies that have survived, you know, both being thrown away and these fires, because they really demolished the records of the company. So, going back to the website, one of these days I'll get for Quelly and Bruce's history updated with the 1936 fire. But in addition to this page, there's Columbia Granite. You'll find, you know, the Westerly Sun series that was done 2012, I believe it was. And there are all these different, there are 52, one a week, that were published in the Westerly Sun. You see some are companies, the Bonner Monument Company, other are individuals like Gervasi is a carver, or James Barrison, or this is the one that's there for Fuzzy Memorials. So that's my favorite graph. To me, that captures the history of the granite industry in Westerly, and I hope you've enjoyed the talk. Yes.
I have a question. You have the companies is numbered here. Are these numbers what that, the
Yeah, so
vertical
this
axis
is number
means?
2. Now, why didn't I start with 1? I won't explain to you why in Excel I started with 2. And so number 2 here, so this is
Okay.
10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80.
Okay, so, yeah.
So if you look at, and I have a few more copies if anybody didn't get a copy and wants a copy. And again, you know, for a few of them, I combine companies, you know, because essentially they seem to be,
Do you have one for the archives?
there's 3. Yes.
Hugh, something happens in the mid to late fifties to half a dozen of those companies. Is there any common thread there? 1955 to 1960 almost?
Well, yeah, that's when, I mean, Lazarus, everybody's shutting down. I'm not sure, you know, sort of.
There was a lawsuit at Smith Granite Company as well, which,
That's what
there was a
I'm-
lawsuit at Smith Granite Company, which also devastated it. But most of it was, after the World War II, you know, the machinery and the men had gone to war. They had sold a lot of the machinery for iron. And people were not buying big monuments and mausoleum in the cemeteries. So and every city and town that wanted a monument in the middle of the square had one by that point. So there were a lot of different factors that really culminated in the 50s. They started earlier. I mean, the trouble started earlier.
Right, well, I
Yeah,
mean,
they
you
went
know,
out of
again,
business.
you know, this period way back here is when you have the most
Yeah.
companies.
Was the lawsuits like on the health issues or, you know? kind of
No, it
slow
was a
process?
business thing.
Yeah. They also, at one point, what was it, the pink granite that was such a big deal here, we kind of ran out of it, right? Like the veins of it kind of
I
disappeared.
can't answer that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes,
Do you have any plans to put this material into some kind of publication? I think it'd be a great addition to the Built from Stone world.
thank you. So, I don't know about a publication, but hopefully at some point we'll get, so this talk will go up on the website, and
Good.
I've been trying to make sure my PDFs of the PowerPoint slides are also posted with the video so you can look at them there, and, you know, we're trying to work on, expanding what's shown for, Westerly Granite on the current website, so hopefully some of this will get somehow, added to the
It's a
website.
great overview, and it's on a much higher scale than the Built from Stone.
Yeah, honestly, until I put this graph together, I mean, I showed you, Built from Stone, I think did a great job of sort of
Oh,
dividing
yeah,
up
absolutely.
the periods. It certainly fit together with the story of just the number of companies. Well, no, it's more than that. You're talking about a whole range of issues about, you know, what the Civil War monument phase went by, and then you got into, you know, building, but then steel took over, so now you're just using granite for facing
And concrete.
yeah. So anyway, John,
I've also read where, the 1938 hurricane, if I read things correctly, power was lost for a long time, and a lot of the quarries began filling up. And the companies decided that they weren't even gonna try pumping a lot of their quarries after that.
Yep.
And they just continued to fill.
yep, that's a great point. No question that because when I gave my infrastructure talk, I talked a little bit about the 1938 hurricane, but, you know, absolutely it damaged the buildings at the quarries. It, like you say, the pumps shut down, and so they filled, because I've forgotten, somebody said, I guess it was, you know, Ike Smith, or maybe he was talking about, you know, from his father, that, you know, as long as there was sort of a rumble, you knew things were fine, but if it went dead silent, you worried, because that meant that the pumps had shut down at the quarry, and they were gonna fill with water. So this quarrying was highly dependent on pumping the water out of the quarries
That's an
because
interesting
of
point,
the
John. There
depths
was
that they were going.
To this day, I get water in my basement.